to our 25th episode of Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia. This series continues the battle to stop those false narratives about our railways that sometimes threaten to take over the sensible discourse. And today, we will continue the war theme and talk about how some of our false narratives draw on fictions about the impact of the Great Depression, as well as World War II, on Australian rail. In this series, we always draw on earlier episodes in the story and link everything back. For example, if you saw episode 8, Who Blamed Roger Rabbit? We debunked the idea that the road lobby killed off Australian railways, and the period when this killing off was supposed to have happened is vaguely similar, any time from the 1920s to the 1950s. Of course, it wasn't true, but it leaves us thinking, if the cause wasn't the road lobby, then what was it? In our 13th episode, Those Were the Days, my friends, we looked at how the past was not at all what it was cracked up to be. And part of that story is that the Depression and the war were both bad for rail, but that historians will sometimes tell the story as if the people involved were heroes. The official histories talk about the official heroes, such as the railway commissioners, or even the politicians, while the social histories tend to romanticise the workforce. But today, we will look at the true problems with our bureaucracy. And before we do, a reminder, if you haven't seen all our earlier episodes, that this channel ranges all over the world. In our episode 9, about mainline electrification, we went to wartime France and saw the damage and destruction that was done, but then what arose from the ashes. And in a future episode, we will travel to Japan, another country that raised itself up very quickly from utter ruin. And we will compare and contrast Australia with the French and the Japanese. Your Mad Professor's story can be very personal, as can many families in Australia. One grandfather fought the Japanese in Darwin and Cairns, and then over the skies of Southeast Asia. The other spent the war making artillery shells in a factory. So this story will take us to Darwin. Today's episode definitely involves Darwin, but not maybe in the way you think. Let's take the time machine back to the late 1930s and a street corner in Sydney overlooking the tram terminus. In the 1920s, we saw the last real burst of enthusiasm within the political and bureaucratic classes for railways, and the hiatus that followed, which lasted until the 2000s. This is when cheap money meant governments around the country started seeing the long overdue demand for railway expenditure starting to be addressed by politicians' promises. It would be wrong to say nothing happened in that 80-year period. Many commentators will point to projects like the Perth electrification, or the standard gauge line from Sydney to Perth, or Melbourne's City Loop during that time. But really, these projects were all small fry by today's standards, and were also long overdue. And in the case of the City Loop, it had sat in the filing cabinet drawer for so long that by the time it was being built, it was already the wrong project. The 1920s saw governments embark on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Sydney Underground lines, electrification in Sydney and Melbourne. Projects today would be in the many tens of billions to do. And for a national population in 1925 of only 5.5 million, about 20% of what it is today. Some other projects in the 1920s were not so good for rail, with some wasteful, last-minute spending on branch lines to places like Red Hill or Kaiwong, some projects that were important but poorly delivered. This would include the winding and poorly laid tracks that became the main lines from Sydney to Brisbane, or Brisbane to Cairns, and across the desert flood pans to Alice Springs. But they were large spending commitments nonetheless. Americans date the Great Depression to the Wall Street crash of 1929. But there is evidence that the economic malaise began for Australians much earlier, We were not dependent on the splashes of cash on the share markets, but very much on the terms of trade for our limited exports of wheat and wool, and trade was largely confined within the British Empire. Definitely by the 1930s, we were confronted with the twin problems of the collapse of economic activity and the need to repay debt to foreign bondholders. The conflict between these two problems was famously the trigger that many commentators think might have led to a civil war. Jack Lang, the charismatic Labor leader of New South Wales, wanted to promote the state and keep people employed by defaulting on the debt. But Governor Philip Game sacked him. This happened days after Lang had opened the Harbour Bridge, a symbol of defiance against those who wanted the government to be spending less money. And this opening was famously disrupted by Francis de Groot, a member of the so-called New Guard, a fascist organisation that wanted Lang executed, and New South Wales to be run by a committee of banks who were owed money. Thankfully, Australia got through that period of political instability, but the toll of austerity was hard on people and the economy, possibly harder than it was in the US or Europe, and Australia was definitely slower to recover than those jurisdictions were. As the march towards war in Europe and Asia progressed, other countries started spending again, if only to build up their armed forces. But the increased spending in those places had people back in work and money circulating again, and in those countries we saw progress on their railways. In our episode 9 we talked about the extension of electrification in France in the lead up to the war, with lines to Le Mans or Orléans as examples of how the French were starting to spend on improving their network. Yet if we look at the official histories in Australia, such as the VR to 62 edition, it outlines a timeline of significant events on the Victorian railways for each year of its history. However, this timeline shows exactly nothing between the years 1930, when the Glen Waverley line opened, and 1935, when a single air-conditioned passenger carriage was built. In 1937, a much larger project to build a whole train of air-conditioned cars, called the Spirit of Progress, with streamlined locomotives, perhaps showed some slow progress to climb out of the pit that the rail spending had been in for the previous 10 years. And we looked at this project in some detail in episode 14, Our Finest Hour. That episode made the point that we didn't just need one of these trains, but dozens, and the failure to deliver that has harmed Australian rail ever since. There were a few rail projects that opened in the 1930s, though most had been commenced before that decade. For example, the East Hills Railway line opened in 1930, electrified and double track as far as Kingsgrove, and a single unelectrified track beyond. What could be afforded of the Sydney Underground, which was two separate lines, from Central to St James and Central to Wynyard, and the Harbour Bridge, were delivered as they were started in the 1920s, but work on Bradfield's far more extensive scheme, which included lines to the eastern suburbs and inner western suburbs, ground to a complete standstill. The popular narrative among rail enthusiasts and others who seek to make excuses for the powers that be is that none of this could have been avoided. And you don't need to be Jack Lang to see this as rubbish. In our episode 10, Money, 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 we saw that money isn't real, something which Jack Lang knew, as did John Maynard Keynes and others. The economy is really governed by what Keynes called animal spirits, and as soon as the powers that be, whether they be Roosevelt or Hitler, decided the time to start spending again had come, then that spending happened, and the economy soon left its depressed state. But it is more than just a tale of money. The economy is really able to grow and sustain employment if it is focused on productivity. And while we were building unproductive and basically hopeless lines, like the Sydney to Brisbane or Brisbane to Cairns railways so poorly built they needed thousands of staff to run them, and the small locomotives that used them. In the USA or Europe, we saw investments in productivity. In the USA, that was the construction of much heavier railways, with their sleepers packed close together in heavy welded rail. Tunnels that overhung the lines or stopped larger trains from running were often dynamited, or as they called it, daylighting. In Europe, we saw mainline electrification, rebuilding of lines, much heavier and faster locomotives, and the retirement of 19th century trains, all to improve the productivity of rail systems. While railways were only a part of our national productivity, nonetheless. Productivity projects really helped to get the rest of the developed world out of its slump and ready for a war which everyone knew was coming. In fact, in terms of German aggression in Europe and Japanese expansionism in Asia, that war had already begun. Yet our politicians and bureaucrats were asleep, much as the Depression provided a cover for those who would argue it wasn't the fault of our bureaucrats or politicians. The war served this up in spades. The first obvious impact of the war on our railways, in the absence of any enemy appearing on our borders, was the call-up in a railway which was very inefficient and required thousands more staff than it should have. That describes basically all our railways. Allowing railwaymen to volunteer for the military forces, of course, would be disruptive. And as commissioners would be required to prioritise the work of the men who remained, of course, fixing those long-standing problems with our railways might be second on the list, after just keeping the system going. This conundrum is captured in a silly false narrative that does the rounds among rail fans, even 80 years later, about a single Victorian Railways locomotive, named H220. It was built early in the war. This locomotive now sits at the Newport Rail Museum, but has not turned a wheel since the 1960s, which is such a shame, as it is a lovely looking and impressive locomotive. The letter H was thought to stand for heavy, and it got the nickname Heavy Harry, and for its time it was heavy. So heavy, it is said, that it had to be confined to the railway from Melbourne to Albury, which was the only one strong enough to take its weight. A locomotive like this one was needed more widely, particularly on the Melbourne to Adelaide route, which had some steep sections between Bacchus Marsh and Ballarat. This route had some bridges on it that may have not been safely taken for a locomotive this heavy on a regular basis, so this locomotive, with such significant restrictions on it, was the only one of its kind built, according to the silly false narrative. The railways were in a conundrum, because the higher productivity of this locomotive meant that if any locomotive should have been built, this would be the type. The same two-man crew could haul much more train than any other type of locomotive, some of which dated back to the late 1880s. Yet if this locomotive was so restricted in its use, it made more sense to use the scarce workshop capacity to build lighter, more generic locomotives, like this K-class locomotive, that could be used just about anywhere, even if it was less powerful and productive. And to remove the restrictions, for example, to fix the bridges and track to Adelaide, well, that would also require more scarce labour they didn't have, so goes the silly narrative. Yet you can see what a lot of drivel this is. While Victorian bureaucrats were sweating in their beds, thinking whether to build large or small locomotives, up and down Europe, railways were being hammered from the air and on the ground. Locomotives of any size were being destroyed, and the workshops and depots that housed them were targets for bombing. Such workshops which remained were turning out whatever locomotives they could, usually large ones, like the famous Deutsche Reichsbahn Kriegslok, with its 10 driving wheels, built for wherever in Europe the Germans still controlled. If a bridge or tunnel got in the way, the Germans might destroy it. Train crews, who might be ethnic Germans, or from the nationalities of countries they controlled, might be pressed into operating them wherever they could. No nonsense, like here in Australia, where a perfectly good South Australian locomotive would be taken off a train at Surveston, only to place a similar Victorian locomotive at the head of the train. This time wasting would have been a great problem in occupied Europe, whether under the control of the Axis or Allied forces. Heaven help us, and at this point we will invoke the trigger warning. If distressing topics like the war are too much for you, skip to the time shown below. But we need to talk about the tasks of the Deutsche Reichsbahn, including the extermination of European Jews and others for which the railways were central. It is known that the Reichsbahn had every one of their employees and others, such as slaves or prisoners, they had pressed into service, assisting with such gruesome projects right up until the end of the war. As the European rail system started to fall apart, even the UK one, which was protected somewhat on an island, every trick in the book, such as rapid replacement of bombed-out track or propping up damaged bridges with scaffolds, whatever it was, they did it. Passengers and goods trains were stuffed to the rafters, and even the passengers clinging onto the sides of trains as refugees tried to escape the Germans, then later the Russians, as the tides of war shifted across the continent. Nobody in Europe was too worried about producing single examples of a locomotive, or whether the labour to fix a bridge was available. They made it so. Only Australia had the luxury of worrying about this heavy harry, or deliberately building inefficient locomotives, like the K-class. Really, if anyone actually cared, they could have run the heavy harry to Adelaide anyway, and built more of them instead of the K-class, checked after it when it went across the bridge, to see that the bridge had not fallen down, or fixed the bridge in a weekend with a couple of hundred soldiers, a country that had been at war since 1931, and by 1945 was in complete ruins, including much of the rail system. The story of the Japanese rail system also includes their significant investments and involvement in the railways of China, Korea, and Manchuria, and in Southeast Asia after they invaded those countries. In every case, it was a policy of making do with what people they had. War, for many industries, is not about restricting growth or change. In most cases, quite the opposite. The war brought better technology to road vehicles, to aviation, and shipping. We recall, for example, from our episode 21 about self-propelled rail cars, that the famous Budd RDC rail cars of the early 1950s had the same torque converters that the US had installed in its wartime tanks, while the Cummins power plants we saw in other rail cars came from their ships. The Voith transmissions in our rail cars, which we use even up until today, were made by our wartime enemies, the Germans. Commonwealth Railways bought the Wegmann air-conditioned rail cars for our long-distance trains, the same ones that Hitler used for his special train. If you asked the British or Americans whether the war had advanced or retarded their rail technology, they would answer unequivocally that the war advanced their capabilities, despite the physical damage and stress the war imposed on their systems. Yet ask any Australian rail fan, you get a vastly different answer. In terms of the physical damage, your mad professor's grandfather saw it firsthand. He wasn't in Darwin for the first air raid, but came in just a bit later, and spent some of the war with the army, before transferring to the Air Force, to fly missions over the Dutch East Indies. Darwin had a few dozen air raids, and the first one famously took out the wharf, and saw a North Australian Railways locomotive end up at the bottom of the sea. The line was a target for subsequent raids, even as far south as Adelaide River and Katherine. Lots of rolling stock was damaged. However, as people do in wartime, they made do. Your mad professor also had a distant relative on the Tiwi Islands, who was one of those who spotted the incoming Japanese Zeros. She was later evacuated with civilians, first by train to Burdham, where the line finished, then by US Army trucks to Alice Springs, and by train again to Melbourne. She wrote a letter to our relatives about that experience, a letter which is now in the Australian War Museum in Canberra. Her first-hand account suggests, like Europe, everything was thrown together, and personnel, whether they were railwaymen, army, or civilians, pressed into service. Everyone worked to get the railways working, despite the death and destruction around them. Because Darwin was so far away, most Australians were not really conscious of the damage it suffered, and would suffer again in 1974, when Cyclone Tracy hit. The Japanese also hit Townsville, Broome, Newcastle, and Sydney, though it is not thought any rail assets were hit. Maybe a tram track near Bondi copped it from the submarine that shelled the area. But your mad professor is not aware of any such damage. Despite how traumatic it would have been for these Australians, including my relatives, the impact of the war physically was very minor. Possibly the biggest loss, as we said, was the call-up. So many able-bodied men were overseas. But when you look at how inefficient the rail system was, all these rail lines to distant parts of the countryside that were kept running despite the shortages, and how they needed to keep old, inefficient locomotives and rolling stock in service, that was the real thing holding our system down. And that was the result of poor decision-making of our own pollies and bureaucrats, not because of the Wall Street crash, not because of the foreign bondholders, or Hitler, or the Japanese, or the impossible chicken and egg dilemmas. In episode 9 we took up the theme of how the French recovered from the war. Their system, like most of Europe, was in ruins, having been attacked first by the Germans, then by the Allies, then by the Germans again, with the local resistance doing what it could when the official forces weren't. We saw that the tracks were repaired, then lines to Lyon, Marseille and Bordeaux quickly wired, and within 10 years, massive speed records were being set on these lines, such as the 300 km/h record near Dax. Japan, of course, needs no further reminder. It went from having 2 of its cities nuked to having the world's fastest railway under construction only 14 years later, shocking the world with how quickly it rebuilt. The narrative in Australia was that labour and material shortages continued after the war. We kept our wartime rationing going until just about 1950. You will also hear that money and debt was a problem after the war, as if that wasn't also the case in France, or Germany, or Japan. All three basically needed their currencies restarted from scratch, partly as a way of flushing out the war criminals who had been hiding their loot, but also because, as we said in episode 10, money is an illusion that is only maintained if the people creating the money have credibility, and those regimes had none. Victorian Railways embarked on the grandly named Operation Phoenix to rebuild the system from the ashes. The other systems did not call their post-war programs such grand names, but it doesn't matter either way, because the decision-making was still pathetic, and the work done both insufficient and wrong. In the USA, the immediate post-war years were the opportunity for the private railroads to dieselise, and mainline dieselisation was all but complete. By about 1960, productivity went up many-fold as General Motors EMD 567s and other locomotives, sometimes installed as a 3-unit locomotive, as seen here, replaced many steam locomotives, and their excessive crewing and maintenance costs. Lines continued to be upgraded with mechanised track replacement. In Victoria, they foolishly looked to Britain, busy making its own mistakes, which we reviewed in our episode Dr. Beeching, I presume, and they were a poor model for post-war improvement. From them, we got the wasteful and garbage Walker rail cars, such as this one that continues to run for tourists at Healesville. The British insisted we continue with steam, so ended up with the lovely but redundant R and J class locomotives, which were actually delivered after the Americans provided some of their diesels. Vast numbers of small wagons, unable to efficiently handle the traffic, but also foolishly paid for by the taxpayer, rather than those wagon pools we explored in our last episode, Sugar, meant that most wagons spent most of the time sitting idle rather than working, and rather than replace all the old and pathetic passenger rolling stock with fast, air-conditioned and steel-bodied rolling stock, we ended up keeping these wooden cars running until the 1980s. Many branch lines that could never make a quid were also retained, while the passengers and shippers went on with their road and air transport. Both these modes, even without the luxury of government funding, were progressing in leaps and bounds. The USA embarked on its extensive freeway networks across the country. But even without that, Australians still went on with their cars and buses and left the railways. We did not even start any semblance of freeway construction until the late 1960s and early 1970s. Those rail enthusiasts and some of the official historians like to tell myths about the post-war recovery, but really, it was just a continuation of the previous capital strike. Any fool could see purchasing small quantities of diesels, as New South Wales frequently did. Only buying 5 or 10 at a time was never going to deliver the productivity we needed. This 19-class locomotive, a charming small steam locomotive from the 1880s, was still at work in Sydney in 1971. This would have been unbelievable in America or Europe. Those things we really needed, such as good, robust mainline electrification, dieselisation, standardisation, and the replacement of four-wheel wagons and old wooden passenger cars, should have been complete by 1960 at the very latest, and ideally much earlier. Even with the replacement continuing during the war, noting that the productivity they delivered would have been needed immediately for the war effort. All this failure ties into the bad behaviour of our decision makers in our systems. Our bureaucrats' mission seemed to be: do your best to ignore the looming trends, whether it is technological change, or competition from rival modes, or a looming war. Then, when these things hit, spend all your effort generating lies about how none of this was your fault and nothing could be done. You never had the money, you say, you never had the labour or materials to do the job properly, so you did the bare minimum. Perhaps it would have been better if some of our bureaucrats had been forced to do their time, lumping the rails and sleepers themselves, while the bombs rained down around them, in war-torn Europe, or even in Darwin. Maybe that would have made them realise how shallow their lies were. Next time on Radically Rethinking Railways, there will be another short break as we head to the land of the stand-up station noodles, the ekiben and the staff in their white gloves. We should learn from them and get our railways turning Japanese in our next episode. See you then.